Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses, a series on the history of the Christian faith. In part 2, we'll continue to focus on a number of social conditions that affected the lives of people in the 19th century. And we'll go on to examine the way in which many people, led by their Christian convictions, sought to bring change to the lives of the people impacted by these negative social conditions. We'll focus on key Christian leaders who were involved in the early trade union movement, as well as a movement called Christian Socialism, and the formation of the English Labour Party. In particular, we'll look at the impact of F.D. Maurice, James Keir-Hardy, and others, and we'll then continue with an examination of the impact of William and Catherine Booth and their involvement in the formation of the Salvation Army. Trade unions at this time were, of course, illegal. But as many work unions began to be formed, many of those involved were concerned Christians. One influential group came from the ranks of the Primitive Methodists. Now, Primitive Methodism provided a training ground for labour leaders because local preachers became more skilled in the art of public speaking, and also because it gave its laymen a larger share in its government than any other religious denominations in the country. Therefore, it encouraged democratic ideals. These men, who advocated both political and social improvement, did so at a cost. Sometimes they faced dismissal and even imprisonment because of their views. For example, George Lovelace, who was a Methodist local preacher, had been sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia for his role in organising a union to protest the lowering of wages from 10 shillings to 7 shillings a week. All 6 men that were involved were all transported, and they became known as the Toll Puddle Martyrs. After being sentenced, Lovelace later wrote, "God is our guide, from field, from wave, from plough, from anvil, and from loom. We come our country's rights to save, and speak a tyrant's faction's doom. We raise the watchword liberty. We will, we will, we will be free." In his book, The Romance of Primitive Methodism, written in 1909, Joseph Ritson said, "Who trained and inspired with the instinct of freedom the early leaders of trade unionism? Who fostered in the dark days of serfdom a healthy self-reliance and a manly independence? Who intervened in the days when rural England was seething with disaffection and, securing the moral regeneration of the people, averted a bloody revolution and turned men's minds into the path of constitutional reform? The Primitive Methodists were largely instrumental in accomplishing all these things, as there is abundant evidence to show." One such example was that of John Wilson. Now, Wilson had been a coal miner in the Durham area. He was converted at the age of 31 years of age, and he became a local preacher for the Primitive Methodists. Speaking regarding his conversion, he gives us an insight as to why he was involved in the labour movement. He said, "All was joy, and not the least joyous was myself, even while the tears were chasing down my cheeks. This change made, I began seriously to consider how I could be useful in this life." Shortly after this, he became one of the founders of the Durham Miners Association, for which he lost his job. However, he was then given a position within the Miners' Union, and then later was one of the earliest Labour representatives in the English Parliament. Christians were also actively involved in addressing other areas of social inequality. For example, in April 1848, a group of Christians met in London who actively supported the goals of the movement called Chartism. Now, the Chartists advocated universal male suffrage. In other words, all men over the age of 21 should be allowed the right to vote. They also wanted equal electoral districts, vote by secret ballot, an annually elected parliament, a payment of members of parliament, and the abolition of the property qualifications for parliamentary membership, enabling those without financial wealth to be members of parliament. They had met in response to the House of Commons' rejection of a recent petition in support of Chartism, and those that made up this movement discussed how the church could help to prevent revolution by tackling what they considered were the reasonable grievances of the working class. There was also around this time the emergence of a movement known as Socialism. Many Christian leaders found themselves in agreement with many of the aims of socialism, and eventually a movement known as Christian Socialism was formed in 1848. John Frederick Denison Maurice, or as it was pronounced, Maurice, was acknowledged as a leader of the group, and his book, The Kingdom of Christ, written in 1838, became the theological basis of Christian socialism. Maurice was an ordained Anglican minister. In 1840, he was appointed as Professor of English History and Literature, and then in 1848, the Professor of Divinity at King's College in London. Apart from his work among the Christian socialists, he helped found Queen's College for the education of women, and this was established in 1848. It was the first girls' school to have been given a royal charter. This meant that they had power to grant degrees to women, and Maurice became its first principal. However, due to opposition to his Christian socialist views, along with the accusation that some of his religious views were heterodox, for example, he didn't believe in an eternal hell, he was dismissed from King's College. To save further embarrassment to Queen's College, he chose to resign from there. Maurice argued that politics and religion were inseparable, and that the church should be involved in addressing social questions. He'd written, "You say there are two principles, one Christian, one secular, and that the two can never be brought into agreement. Therefore, let the Christian church have nothing to do with the ordinary civil dealings of men. We say there are two principles, one Christian, one secular, and that the two can never be brought into agreement together. Therefore, let Christianity claim dominion over all the ordinary civil affairs of men, and deny the right of the secular principle over any of them." He rejected individualism with its competition and selfishness, and suggested a socialist alternative to the economic principles of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire meaning let alone, there shouldn't be any government or legislative control of business, and market forces should be allowed to bring about changes without restrictions. In contrast, the Christian socialists suggested that profit sharing as a way of improving the status of the working classes and should be used as a means of producing a just Christian society. The Christian socialists produced a series of pamphlets, commenced a night school, helped to form 8 working men's associations, and established the London Cooperative Store. The Christian socialists wanted, among other things, the nationalisation or government ownership of natural resources, production and distribution, including the railways. Maurice was himself instrumental in establishing the London Working Men's College, and these were all set up to assist working men and helping them advance by providing the opportunity for further education. Then, in 1866, he became Professor of Moral Philosophy at Cambridge University. From his wife's description, he was a man of prayer. She said, whenever he woke in the night, he was always praying. Now, what was the basis for Maurice's social concern? He wrote, every hope I had for human culture, for the reconciliation of opposing schools, for blessings to mankind, was based on theology. 1848 was also the same year that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote their Communist Manifesto. In it, they advocated a much more violent path in achieving social change and achieving equity for the struggling workers. And their movement would be known as communism. Another social reformer and Labour leader, influenced by their Christian faith, was James Keir-Hardy. Hardy was born in 1856. He was the illegitimate son of a Mary Keir, who was a servant from North Lanarkshire in Scotland. Mary later married a David Hardy, and together they moved to Glasgow. The Hardy family was extremely poor, and James was expected to go out and find work as early as he could. So at the age of 7, the illiterate James began to work. He spent time in a number of different jobs, including working as a baker's delivery boy. In some cases, he had to work for up to 12 and a half hours per day. His stepfather was unemployed and his mother was pregnant, so for a time, James was the only wage earner in the family. In the January of 1866, his younger brother was dying, and after spending most of the night looking after him, he arrived late for work. As a result, his employer sacked the 10-year-old James and fined him a week's wages as punishment. Unable to find work in Glasgow, the family moved back to Lanarkshire, and around the age of 11, he began to work in the coal mines. It was about that time that his mother and perhaps his stepfather began to teach him to read and write, and so he would study in the evening after spending 12 hours during the day down the mine. And by the age of 17, he was able to read and write. Keir-Hardy was converted to the Christian faith in 1877 when aged 21. He wrote in his diary, "Today I've given my life to Jesus Christ." He became a lay preacher for the Evangelical Union Church and also became active in the Temperance Society. Now, the Temperance Society and the temperance movement around it sought to curb the social problems associated with alcohol abuse. By this stage, he'd already begun to read newspapers and discovered how some workers were attempting to improve their wages and working conditions by forming trade unions. As a result, he helped establish a union at his colliery. He challenged one mine owner, a prominent Christian, with the words of Jesus from Matthew 7:12, "Do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." In 1880, he led the first ever strike of Lanarkshire miners, for which he was dismissed. He moved from Lanarkshire and eventually worked as a journalist for a local paper. Then in 1886, Keir-Hardy was appointed secretary for the Ayrshire Miners' Union, and then later he became the secretary of the Scottish Miners' Federation. In the following year, he began publishing a newspaper, later known as the Labour Leader. He attempted to use the newspaper to give the miners a political education. He then decided that the working class needed its own political party, and in 1888 he stood as an independent Labor candidate, but failed miserably at the election. Undaunted by this, he stood again in the 1892 general election, and this time he won the seat and he became the country's first socialist member of parliament. Right from the beginning, he caused interest when, instead of wearing the traditional top hat and long black coat, he entered parliament wearing a cloth cap and a tweed suit. In the House of Commons, he began advocating policies that would improve the lot of the lower classes. For example, he supported a progressive income tax. He argued that people earning more than £1,000 a year should pay a higher proportion of tax. He also fought for old age pensions and for free education for the working class. Hardy supported what many other Christians at the time called Christian Socialism, and this was very different in many respects to communism. The most distinctive was that it drew on Jesus' injunction to love your neighbour. He attacked the privileges of the monarchy, and he sought to abolish the House of Lords, those who were able to become parliamentarians on the basis of their social status. However, he was not elected in the 1895 election, but during that time he used his newspaper to give advice on how to conduct meetings, how to organise groups such as socialist church groups, and even Sunday school classes. Despite being a strong Christian, he remained friends with atheists such as Jenny Eleanor Marx, who was Karl Marx's daughter, and Friedrich Engels. But of course, the dominant influence on his political ideas were his religious beliefs. As he wrote, "It is not enough to pray to God or sing hymns unless our lives are consecrated to the service of God through humanity." Keir-Hardy supported the right for women to vote. While not agreeing with the militant suffragettes, and he actually opposed the use of violence, he was sympathetic to Emmeline Pankhurst, and as a result, in 1896 he was invited by her to address one of their open-air meetings. 50,000 people gathered in support of the right of women to vote, but the gathering was considered illegal, and so Keir-Hardy was arrested. But due to concerns regarding repercussions of this, he was released soon after. Hardy also worked for the formation of a single Labor Party, and this was eventually achieved in 1900. He was elected as one of only 2 MPs in the newly formed Labor Party. But by 1906, the party had won 29 seats, and he was elected as its leader. His other political concerns included supporting self-rule in India. In addition, allowing for equal rights for non-whites in South Africa. As a response to his views, he was attacked in the newspapers and called a troublemaker. In a speech to Parliament in the year 1901, Keir-Hardy said, "We are called upon at the beginning of the 20th century to decide the question propounded in the Sermon on the Mount as to whether we will worship God or mammon. The present day is a mammon worshipping age." Because of his pacifist views, he even disagreed with many members of his own party in opposing being involved in the First World War, which had begun in the June of 1914. For such views, he was called a traitor. Despite being ill, he spoke at a gathering for those opposed to war. Keir-Hardy died shortly after on the 25th of September 1915, aged 59 years. In explaining the influence that his Christian faith had on his political beliefs, James Keir-Hardy had said, "I've said both in writing and from the platform many times that the impetus which drove me first into the labour movement and the inspiration which has carried me on in it has been derived more from the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth than from all other sources combined." There were many others who, as a result of their Christian convictions, were also involved in politics and advocated reform. John Clifford was an English Baptist who became pastor at Westbourne Park in London. There he helped establish the Westbourne Park Institute. This was an institution which provided free adult education, the Mutual Economic Benefit Society, an organisation that provided sickness benefit, the Westbourne Park Permanent Building Society, which was to encourage the poor to save, and a Labour Bureau, which was to assist those seeking work. Clifford was a very influential and well-respected Baptist pastor, and he later became the president of the National Baptist Union, as well as the president of the Baptist World Alliance. In 1899, Clifford became one of the leaders of the campaign against the Boer War. He became the president of Stop the War Committee and a member of the South Africa Conciliation Committee. He was very critical of the policy of burning Boer farms and the placing of women and children into concentration camps. He also opposed the negotiated terms of the Union of South Africa because it didn't give equal rights to the country's black population. John Clifford's concerns were many and varied, and they included the support of the de-establishment of the Church of England, an extension of the voting franchise, supporting the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, encouraging the right for women to vote, the admission of a known atheist to the House of Commons. He supported Irish Home Rule, the Temperance Society, and Trade Unionism. The Christian Social Union was an organisation founded in 1889 within the Church of England. It was devoted to the addressing of social conditions and the removing of social injustice. The group was influenced by the writings of Frederick Maurice, and it had as one of its investigators Brooke Foss Westcott, who was the Cambridge New Testament scholar, and Westcott later became the bishop of the industrial city of Durham. Westcott was regarded as a tactful negotiator, as he was able to successfully mediate in a labour dispute by the coal miners in the year 1892. There were, of course, many who opposed the work of those we've mentioned. Some had a totally different view towards poverty. For example, The Economist in 1848 said, "Suffering and evil are nature's admonitions. They cannot be got rid of, and the impatient attempts of benevolence to banish them from the world by legislation have always been more productive of evil than good." The phrase, "heaven helps those who help themselves," were the opening words of Samuel Smiles' book called Self-Help. This was a collection of biographies of people who had made it, in inverted commas. And Thomas Mathis, in his essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, written in 1798, argued that war, famine and disease had a positive value. The American William Graham Sumner, an ordained clergyman and a social science lecturer at Yale University, espoused a view of social Darwinism, i.e., that the rich were a result of natural selection. He said, "Vice is its own curse. If we let nature alone, she cures vice by the most frightful penalties. It may shock you to hear me say it, but when you get over the shock, it will do you good to think of it. A drunkard in the gutter is just where he ought to be. Nature is working away at him to get him out of the way, just as she sets up her processes of dissolution to remove whatever is a failure in its line. Gambling and less mentionable vices all cure themselves by the ruin and dissolution of their victims." By the early to the mid-1800s, many Wesleyan Methodist churches had become staid and respectable. As Wesley himself had predicted, many of the Christian working class would become hard-working, sober, and thrifty, and as a result they would become middle class. However, as they did so, they lost touch with the working class and the poor. But one couple who helped redress this situation was William and Catherine Booth. William was born in 1829 in the city of Nottingham. He experienced poverty firsthand when his father lost money through some unwise investments. Then later he experienced the negative impact of alcohol when his father became an alcoholic. He became an apprentice pawnbroker in order to help the family's financial situation. He was only 13 years of age. And then just shortly after this, his father passed away. William was converted to the Christian faith after attending a Wesley chapel. It was 11 p.m. at night, and it was while coming home from one of the services that he was saved in the middle of the street. He was only 15 years of age. He then became involved with one of the Methodist groups called the Methodist New Connection. Now, the Methodist New Connection had broken away from the main Methodist body over questions of church governance and discipline. By the age of 17, he was licensed by them and he preached his first sermon, and it was soon apparent that he had a gift for preaching. Also, not long after he was converted, he demonstrated his concern for the poor and the outcast, and he began to bring them to the services. However, the church authorities rebuked him for bringing in the so-called riffraff to worship. He was told that they could attend worship only if they entered and left by the rear door of the chapel. And once inside, they were to remain behind the pulpit platform where they could not be seen. Then in 1849, after completing his apprenticeship, he moved to London. He eventually joined another group called the Wesleyan Reformed Union, and he was offered the pastorship of one of their chapels in London. He accepted and became a full-time preacher at their headquarters at Binfield Chapel, situated in Clapham in London. It was while in London he met Catherine Mumford, and in 1852 they became engaged. Meanwhile, William Booth was gaining a reputation as being a powerful preacher and an evangelist. Then, in the same year as his engagement, Booth was invited to become a Wesleyan Reform Union minister at Spalding in Lincolnshire. There was no church buildings and there were about 30 different groups to serve and organise. So he had to travel widely, mostly on foot, and would preach in a variety of locations, including outside. His fiancée was concerned about the workload he had taken on. Then by 1855 he had moved back to London, and there he married Catherine. His wife Catherine was a thinker, and she influenced William regarding many issues, for example, such as on female ministry, temperance, and social action, and together they had 8 children. She encouraged him to rejoin the Methodist New Connection. Almost immediately after they were married, they became involved in ministry. They'd arrived at the pier on the island of Guernsey for their honeymoon when a number of people assembled to request that William conduct revival meetings there. He agreed, and the effects were immediate. The crowds were so large that the doors of the church had to be opened early in order to allow the people to come in for the evening service. Another example of the impact of his preaching can be seen in his record of his visit to Burslem in Staffordshire in the same year of 1855. He said, "I arrived here in Burslem about 9 o'clock on Saturday, after a very cold and wearisome journey. I found a hearty welcome from the friends where I am now staying, and they do all they can to make me happy. It's a very nice town, containing about 1,500 inhabitants. The chapel is a very unique and comfortable one, rather small, will hold about 800 persons. I never preached to a congregation so packed in my life as it was last night, and I suppose hundreds went away unable to obtain admission. All up the pulpit stairs, in the aisles, in the rails, in fact, wherever there was standing room. I preached with a little liberty and some power, and about 40 names were taken down during the progress of the prayer meeting. The love feast in the afternoon was a very interesting one. On the whole, it was the best beginning I have as yet been privileged to have." In the summer of 1857, the Booth family moved to Brickhouse in Yorkshire, where he was appointed preacher at the Bethel Chapel. There, their social concerns were seen in the example of 7-year-old girls working in a local mill. Both William and Catherine campaigned against this practice. In 1858, he was ordained as a Methodist New Connection minister. Then, by 1859, he and his wife had moved to Gateshead, which is now part of the city of Newcastle, in the county of Durham. When they first arrived at the church in Gateshead, there were only 90 members on the chapel roll. However, after they took over, within the first fortnight of their arrival, there'd been 160 conversions and the chapel was filled to overflowing. It could seat 1,200 people, but many would have to sit on window ledges, stairs and any other available spot to be able to hear Booth preaching. Then, one Sunday in 1860, Catherine Booth got up to say just a few words, but that led to a 2-hour sermon delivered without notes. A few months later, when William was confined to bed due to illness, Catherine conducted all of his preaching appointments and his pastoral duties, and she developed a reputation that would stay with her as a great preacher to the end of her life. Apart from the main church, Bethesda, at Gateshead, there were at least 14 circuit chapels. And in 1861, Booth preached in all of them, and then had a final rally, which was held at Bethesda. There were more than 5,000 people that were in attendance. He had such a successful evangelistic ministry there that the church was known as the Conversion Shop. Peter Monk, who became converted under his ministry, said, "It seemed as if he'd tear the soul out of your body, and then, in the midst of it all, there'd be a bit that would make you want to cry, or a tale that would set you laughing fit to bust." William was soon invited to preach in other connection churches throughout England. As a result of these evangelistic services, thousands professed faith in Christ. Once, in a space of a few months, Booth saw over 2,000 converts. However, some of the connection leaders saw him as going too far, too fast. His methods were lusty American and not Victorian English, they said. In 1858, he was ordained as a Methodist New Connection minister, but he became unhappy and frustrated because the denomination kept assigning him to a pastorate, which he had to neglect in order to respond to numerous evangelistic campaigns. Finally, in 1861, after 3 years at Gateshead, Booth, having had issues with the Methodist New Connection, and in particular their perceived lack of urgency in proclaiming the gospel, he chose to resign. He said, "Trusting in God alone, I offer myself for evangelistic work in the first instance to our own connectional churches, and when they decline to engage me, to other portions of the religious community. I offer myself to cooperate in conducting special services or preaching to outlying crowds of our populations in theatres, halls, or in the open air." And so for the next 4 years, William and Catherine together worked as independent evangelists, leading campaigns across the country. During this time, he used some new approaches in his outreach. For example, he hired neutral buildings for the purpose and used the testimonies of people who'd been converted in similar difficult circumstances as his listeners. He also employed speaking to working people in a down-to-earth language that they could understand. As mentioned, they had eventually settled in London, and by 1864 they'd been able to acquire a former beer shop. It was called the Eastern Star, and it became the permanent headquarters of the mission, as it was called. Then, in mid-1865, a successful outreach had begun among the poor in London. It had been organised by the East London Special Services Committee and was held in a tent which had been erected on the disused Quakers' burial ground at Bunhills. Booth said he was about to leave for Derby when he was requested to conduct a week's services. Booth stayed, and this is what he said about the impact of those services. These meetings were largely attended and gracious influences were vouchsafed. Many sinners were awakened, and a very general desire was expressed by Christian friends interested in the east of London that I should devote the whole of my time to that part of the metropolis. At first sight, I felt the importance of the sphere. In every direction were multitudes totally ignorant of the gospel and given up to all kinds of wickedness: infidels, drunkards, thieves, harlots, gamblers, blasphemers, and pleasure seekers. Meetings were held in the tent 3 times on the Sunday and every night during the week. The services continued in the tent for about 6 weeks. There was some opposition. For example, on occasions, guy ropes were cut, and sometimes even bringing the whole tent down. Many responded to William Booth's preaching at the tent meeting and were converted. And it was to these people that William now dedicated his life. Coming home to Catherine one evening, he declared, "I have found my destiny." So the Christian mission, as it was then called, had begun. They reached out to criminals, prostitutes, and the poor. Not only did they preach, but they also had soup kitchens to feed the hungry. The mission grew quickly, and by 1867 there were 10 full-time workers, and by 1874 the numbers had grown to over 1,000 volunteers and 42 evangelists. William Booth then began preaching at the Effingham Theatre, which was in Whitechapel Road in East London. This became a regular preaching space and could contain up to 3,000 people. In one report from the mission, it was, quote, crowded to the ceiling. As well as utilising many theatres in London, They also commissioned posters that mimicked the style of theatre posters. They sought to attract the eye of the passerby, already used to seeing such posters for the theatre. In 1870, the People's Mission Hall was purchased by the Christian Mission, and it then housed the organisation's headquarters and did so till 1881. There was a soup kitchen next door which sold cheap food for the poor. There was also the emphasis on prayer, particularly fervent prayer, and it was in this building that all-night of prayer meetings were held before Booth went out preaching. Booth said, "The power of God was wonderfully manifest in these meetings. People were frequently struck down, overwhelmed with a sense of the presence and power of God." Booth's battle cry became, "Go for souls and go for the worst." It was in the year 1878 that the movement changed its name and it became known as the Salvation Army, and it was structured on army lines, with William Booth becoming the general and groups and members called corps. The army operated on 5 principles, which were outdoor meetings and processions, visiting pubs, prisons and private homes, holding meetings in theatres, factories and other unusual buildings, using popular tunes and the language of everyday life, and finally, making every new convert a witness for Christ. Modelling themselves on the regular army, they developed a distinctive uniform, and flags were also soon included. And then a musical family joined the outdoor evangelistic efforts, and from this developed the Salvation Army Band. The name actually came about when William Booth was dictating a letter to his secretary, and he used the phrase, "The Christian mission is a volunteer army." It was his teenage son, Bramwell, who heard and said, "Volunteer? I'm not a volunteer. I'm a regular," meaning regular soldier, "or nothing." And this prompted William Booth to substitute the word Salvation Army for the Volunteer Army. And so the Salvation Army was born. Booth's success attracted not only supporters, but also enemies. He and his workers often suffered physical assaults, and many times Booth came home bleeding and bruised after being attacked for preaching in the slums. In the early days, a so-called skeleton army, which parodied the Salvation Army, was organised by the breweries in order to break up their meetings. The breweries saw Booth's advocacy of teetotalism as a threat to their profits. In 1882, 662 soldiers were assaulted and 60 army buildings were damaged, mainly through the opposition by these skeleton armies. Many Salvationists, as they were then known, also suffered imprisonment, usually on the charge of obstruction. An obstruction could cover anything from processions to kneeling in the street to pray, and by the end of 1884, about 600 Salvationists had gone to prison for this charge. Freedom for the right to march and hold open-air meetings was not fully established until 1912. Even some Christians opposed them. Lord Shaftesbury, for example, thought that the Salvation Army was the trick of the devil, trying to make Christianity look ridiculous. Undaunted by this opposition, the Booths continued their work, and their soldiers provided free Sunday morning breakfast for the poor, and they bought old factories and warehouses and cleaned them and warmed them, and there gave the destitute rest and food. Then there were other areas of concern that the Salvation Army adopted. One was to increase the age of sexual intercourse. Many Christians had been concerned about sexual practices involving young girls, who were unprotected by law and so were vulnerable to sexual predators. So William organised a petition with nearly 400,000 signatures demanding an improvement in legislation, and the Law Amendment Act of 1885 was the result. And this raised the age of consent for sexual intercourse from 13 to 16 years. They also set up a missing persons department, and this work still continues today. And as a result, every year about 10,000 people are reunited with their families. In addition to this, he worked in the area of development of Sunday schools and education. He wrote a catechism for Christian teaching and provided day education for those who were in places where there was no free education. Perhaps one of the more unusual ventures was the development of safety matches. Originally, matches were made with a poisonous phosphorus substance which attacked the lips and caused an incurable disfigurement called necrosis amongst the workers. So Booth and the Army purchased an empty factory. They fitted it with large windows and wash basins, and people were then employed to make safe matches. Booth then encouraged people to avoid buying poisonous matches, and as a result of these efforts, people purchased these safety matches, and necrosis was gradually wiped out. The movement continued to grow and expand. For example, here's a sketch of a new place of worship in Manchester to be built in 1884. It was called the Poor Man's Palace. The Christian Mission headquarters in Whitechapel Road in London became the Army's first international headquarters in the year 1880. But soon after, William Booth decided that a move further into the City of London would be more beneficial, and so in 1881, the international headquarters was moved to 101 Queen Victoria Street. In 1891, 3,200 acres in Essex was purchased and the Hadley Farm Colony was established. There, young residents were provided with accommodation, a bathhouse, laundry, reading room, hospital, and a meeting room. There they learned farming, market gardening, brickmaking and construction, and this enabled them to find jobs when they emigrated to overseas British colonies. Now briefly we'll examine the Salvation Army's view of the sacraments of baptism and communion, and in particular why they do not practice either. In 1883, William Booth officially announced that the Salvation Army would stop observing them and they would wait to a future time point when a definitive decision might be made. Note here in this quote, it was not that Booth was against the sacraments, but fundamentally Booth did not think of the Salvation Army as a church. Rather, he understood it as a Christian movement. He said, "Now if the sacraments are not conditions of salvation, and if the introduction of them would create division of opinion and heartburning, and if we are not professing to be a church, not aiming at being one, but simply a force for aggressive salvation purposes, is it not wise for us to postpone any settlement of the question, to leave it over for some future day when we shall have more light?" In 1889, after many decades living in London, sometimes in some very poor areas such as the East End, the Booths moved from London to Hadley Wood, which was about 20 kilometres north. They moved because Catherine was in poor health, and it was thought that she would benefit from the country air. However, her ill health continued, and so they had to move back closer to London. In the year 1890, his wife died, and in the same year he wrote In Darkest England and the Way Out. He argued that the poorest 10% of people in England were no better off than some slaves in Africa, and he proposed to rid England of poverty by 10 principles. The principles Booth wanted to introduce to bring about positive change included establishing homes for the homeless, establishing farm communities where the urban poor could be trained in agriculture, establishing training centres for prospective immigrants, having homes for prostitutes and released prisoners, giving aid to the poor, and assistance and help for alcoholics. He also laid down schemes for poor men's lawyers, banks, clinics, industrial schools, and even a seaside resort. He said that if the state failed to meet its social obligations, then it was the task of each Christian to work for these goals. Booth also spoke about the issues of waste and emphasised what we now know or call recycling. And his ideas eventually led to the establishment of charity or opportunity shops. He made the first of many visits to the United States in 1895. There he found over 500 people already engaged in the work of the Salvation Army. He held 340 meetings in 86 cities, speaking to over 400,000 people, resulting in 2,200 converts. Twice, while in America, he opened the Senate with prayer. He then went to South Africa, where he spoke for 7 hours at one time, his heart yearning over the lost. In 1904, he passed from one side of Great Britain to the other. On this tour, William, in his typical progressive style, utilised the motorcar for the purpose, as this video from that time shows.
William Booth, an old man in his 75th year, yet had the courage and determination to inaugurate an entirely new method of campaigning. In the autumn of 1904, he used a motor car to tour from one end of the kingdom to the other. During this first motor campaign, a distance of 1,250 miles was covered. Imagine what this meant in these primitive cars for a man in his 70s. There were some people who disapproved of these methods, but on the whole, the imagination of the world was struck with sympathy and approval that this very old man should adopt the latest invention of science at the end of his life's work. Enthusiasm was great. In town or country, large numbers gathered to listen to him, for by now, William Booth, who had faced great opposition for so long, had in his old age achieved worldwide popularity. His work was recognized as the work of one honestly inspired by love of humanity. Campaigning by motorcar soon became one of the general's established methods. In vehicles like these, he journeyed throughout England, Scotland, and Wales.
The Salvation Army continued to expand globally, and in 1904 they had an international conference. And this film from that time illustrates how much the Salvation Army had become an international organisation.
This is a typical London scene in perhaps 1904 or 5, showing a Salvationist meeting assembling outside a public house. Let us catch another glimpse of this world, half a century ago, in movement. This scene shows traffic outside the Mansion House in the City of London. Among the earliest motion pictures of the Army's activities that have been preserved are some scenes of the International Congress in London in the year 1904. Coming out of the Congress meeting are some of the thousands who took part. The hall used was a temporary building in the Strand, specially erected for this purpose. Expansion had taken place since the first Congress 20 years before. Years of consolidation in Britain and tremendous expansion in the many other countries that had been invaded by the army in those 2 decades. The General, accompanied by Commissioners Cadman, Pollard and Kitching, goes to the saluting base for the great march past. This took place at the Crystal Palace. The General acknowledged contingent after contingent from all parts of the world. To William Booth, taking the salute with such vigorous enthusiasm, the International Congress was an event of great importance, for he believed in associating all the races of the earth together in a common religious enthusiasm.
Despite being in his late 70s, he continued to travel. He visited the United States again in 1907, and then in 1908 he went to Scandinavia, and in 1910 he visited Switzerland, Holland, Germany, Italy, and Denmark. Then on the 9th of May 1912, William Booth gave his last major speech to over 7,000 Salvationists at London's Albert Hall. Now, even though in his 80s, his passion for the downtrodden was not diminished, and he said, "While women weep, as they do now, I'll fight. While little children go hungry, while men go to prison, while there is a drunkard left, while there is a poor lost girl upon the streets, while there remains one dark soul without the light of God, I'll fight to the very end." Shortly after this, he had an unsuccessful operation on his eyes. An infection set in and he was told that he would lose his sight completely. His response was, "God knows best. I've done what I could for God and the people with my eyes. Now I must do what I can for God and the people without my eyes." Here we have the only known recording of William Booth preaching, and here he expresses his ongoing concern and his encouragement for all Christians to be active in the area of caring for others.
I am glad you are enjoying yourselves. The Salvationist is the friend of happiness. Making heaven on earth is our business. Serve the Lord with gladness is one of our favorite mottos. So I am pleased that you are pleased. But amidst all your joys, don't forget the sons and daughters of misery. But what shall we do? Content ourselves by singing a hymn, offering a prayer, or giving a little good advice? No. 10,000 times no. We will pity them, feed them, reclaim them, employ them. Perhaps we shall fail with many, quite likely, but our business is to help them all the same, and that in the most practical, economical, and Christ-like manner.
William Booth died in the August of 1912. Once, when asked for the secret of his success, he said, "I'll tell you the secret. God has had all there was of me. There have been men with greater brains than I, men with greater opportunities. But from the day I got the poor of London on my heart and caught a vision of all Jesus Christ could do with them, on that day I made up my mind that God would have all of William Booth there was." William Booth had said, "Work as if everything depended upon your work, and pray as if everything depended upon your prayer."
On the 20th of August 1912, William Booth, God's soldier, laid down his sword. He lay in state in the Congress Hall, London. Thousands came to pay tribute. For the last time, he leaves the Army headquarters in Queen Victoria Street. Through the streets of London, his funeral procession passed, through the city of which he was freeman. The flags of nations invaded by the army were carried proudly at the head of the column. The whole traffic of this metropolis was arrested by one of the densest multitudes that ever thronged its thoroughfares. As the carriage passed the Mansion House, the Lord Mayor of London saluted the coffin. 10,000 men and women from the ranks of the Salvation Army, specially selected to represent their comrades, walked behind their promoted leader, who had taught them to give their lives ministering to the poorest, the lowliest, and the lost.
Christians involved in social issues was not just confined to England. For example, Johann Wichern worked in Germany, and he was concerned for the welfare of the youth in Hamburg. He established a Sunday school, an orphanage, and founded a training school. He began a journal aiming at Christian and social rebirth. He wrote The Inner Mission of the German Evangelical Church, an address to the German nation. He argued that the church had to regenerate all these orders of creation: family, church, and state. As we reflect over this video, we can see that it was through the efforts of Christians such as William Wilberforce, Elizabeth Fry, and Lord Shaftesbury that there'd been legislative reform. William Booth had helped set up welfare programs to help the poor. George Mueller had established large institutions to care for homeless children. Many others followed in the footsteps of these by being involved as Christians in their different spheres of influence. Others were motivated by their Christian convictions to be involved in the union and labour movements in order to improve the lot of workers. Men like John Wilson, James Keir-Hardy, and many other leaders of the primitive Methodists. Whether we agree with all their actions or not, the challenge for us today is to see the areas of need in our situation and then to respond. We should not lose sight of the central need for spiritual regeneration in the lives of people. But we should not forget that loving our neighbour means being concerned for their practical welfare and their physical needs.